So please welcome Paul Boehnke. Thank you. Thank you, Brad. So there I was, playing a piece of music that I hadn't played in 5 years when it happened. My mind was suddenly filled with thoughts of a girl that I had a crush on 5 years earlier. But, you know, there I could feel my heartbeat speeding up and the swirl of emotions sort of throwing me off balance. And it was all feeling kind of sudden and a little unsettling. Because I thought, why am I thinking thoughts from 5 years ago? Thoughts that, well, have nothing to do with my life today. Well, it turns out that the answer to that question would change my life. You see, as the shock of the initial feelings wore off, I realized that those thoughts and feelings returned to my heart and mind at a very specific place in the music that I was playing. Now, back in college, when I was in music school, I was learning this very piece of music. It was hard. And there was this one small 4-measure section that was particularly difficult, and it just was not getting any better over the days and weeks that I had been working on it. So I decided that I was going to spend 40 minutes of one practice time on just those 4 measures, playing them over and over and over, hoping that they would become less awkward. Well, all that repetition worked. They did become less awkward. But the interesting thing is, during those 40 minutes, I was thinking about this girl. And 5 years later, when those thoughts came screaming back to my head, it hit me. I had practiced those thoughts along with those notes. The thoughts and the emotions had become so attached to the physical act of playing those notes that all I had to do was play those notes and those thoughts returned. So I thought, well, gee, wouldn't it be better if, instead of just random thoughts while I was practicing, I had very specific thoughts that maybe helped me play music better. So after about 30 years as a professional classical musician, that's one of the things that I got pretty good at, training my brain to think what I needed it to think, when I needed it to think it. Fast forward a few more years, and I realized there's this little voice in my head that was constantly criticizing me, telling me I wasn't good enough in one way or another. There were so many messages, I just felt surrounded by it, hemmed in on all sides. And I realized that I just wasn't achieving everything that I knew deep inside was possible. Now, we all have crazy, critical voice in our head. It's constantly telling us ways that we're just not quite good enough. It has us second-guessing ourselves. Mine would say things like, well, you know, really, you're not smart enough to do this, or you're not qualified to do that. You don't have the experience for that. It would also say things like, you know, your emotions and what you think is important, they really don't matter. I found myself feeling kind of unacceptable the way I was, and I felt like I'm supposed to be somebody different. I would love to hear from you. What are some of the things that you have heard this voice say? Just go ahead and just shout it out. What have you heard, any of you?
You're not good enough.
You're not good enough. Absolutely. Great example. Anyone else?
You're not going to be able to do that.
You're not going to be able to do that. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
What happens if you do it? What's next?
Oh, what happens if you succeed? Yeah, better be careful with that.
Or you don't know enough.
Don't know enough. Thank you for sharing these. These are great examples. So, what I want you to think about is something I said just a moment ago, is that we all have this voice in our head. Now, if you happen to be thinking at the moment, you know, I don't have that voice in my head, that's the voice I'm talking about right there. Now, there are over 8 billion of us on this planet. What if only, I don't know, a quarter of them, say 2 billion, were free of all that self-critical talk? And what if you were one of those 2 billion? What would you be free to do, to create, to be? And what would it be like to live in a world where everyone was that free? How would that feel? Would you feel energized, excited, optimistic? Would you feel maybe empowered to do what really matters to you? I think that's how I'd feel. Actually, that is how I frequently feel. And the reason is because I figured out a way to get this pesky little voice in my head that is constantly arguing for my limitations to be an ally, to tell me things that support me. Now, we all run into this voice from time to time, and we do our best to overcome it. We stumble around looking for a magic bullet that will finally silence that voice. But that's the problem. We're stumbling around, throwing spaghetti at the wall, hoping that something will stick. What we need is a strategy and a method that will predictably train our brain to think what we want it to do and to help us get there without all those crazy detours along the way. Now, my training and experience as both a musician and now as a life coach have come together in a way that has helped me develop a method that does just that trains your brain to think what you want it to think. And it does that in a way that takes our entire being into consideration, your mind, your emotions, your body, and your spirit. Now, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to share with you this method and how it works. But I have to be honest with you, I don't have time to get into all the details of this process. I've actually written a book on this topic. But if what you find, if this is intriguing to you, I would be happy to continue the conversation after this. We're going to be talking about how to reprogram our thoughts. It seems to me that one of the things we need to get clear on first is what thoughts are. So thoughts, really, they are just electrochemical signals in our brain. Our brain cells use these to communicate with each other. Now, our senses, they take in information from the world around us in all sorts of vibratory forms, whether it's a vibration of light waves or sound waves. And then they pass this information on to the neurons in our brain, which confer with each other, and they compare this new information with information they've seen in the past, and it does its best to figure out what's happening. Our brain, it doesn't see. Our brain doesn't hear. It just looks at the data that it gets and makes its best guess as to what's going on out there. And very often, its conclusions are pretty helpful. They serve us well. They help us navigate life. But when those conclusions are off, this is when it begins to cause us some troubles. We find ourselves responding and behaving in ways that just don't serve us. We can feel confused or lacking in confidence. We can find ourselves sort of procrastinating or tolerating things we just don't need to tolerate. The conclusions our brain comes to shows up in very concrete ways in our life. And if we're to figure out a way how to get past this, we just need to realize that these negative thoughts that we have are really just incorrect conclusions our brain has come to that we have now turned into habits of thought. So habitual that we don't even examine them anymore, we just think them. And that is really the first phase of this process, is to recognize that all these negative thoughts we have, they're just habits. They're not some otherworldly force like kryptonite that is zapping us of power or keeping us imprisoned, you know? They're just thoughts. They're not who you are. They don't define you, unless you decide they do. They're just electrochemical signals in your brain. And this realization alone, this can relieve so much of the pressure that we feel when it comes to these inner critic voices. Now, the second phase of this process is simply to uncover all the lies that this voice has been telling us. Uncover the lies that we have believed about ourselves and the world around us. Now, I have yet to meet an inner critic message that isn't ultimately based on a lie. Now, these lies, they come with plenty of evidence, plenty of reasons to believe them. There tends to be lots of justification and rationalization. They can be pretty loud in your face, hard to ignore. And that's really the biggest clue. Because when somebody is trying to convince you of something, what do? They lay out all the reasons you should believe something. They will dredge up all sorts of evidence to prove that what they're telling you is true. They will justify all the reasons that you should believe what they want you to believe. They will rationalize away any weakness in their argument. They will talk and talk and talk until you are blue in the face. They'll talk until you give in. They can be relentless. But why do they work so hard? Well, they work so hard because what they're trying to convince you of is probably not true. So how does truth convince us? It doesn't. Truth is simply there for us to recognize. It doesn't try to convince anyone of anything. It just is. And we are free to believe it or not. And recognizing truth tends to be a pretty quiet affair. Truth speaks to that still small voice inside. It asks us to be open and receptive. And when we find ourselves filled with distraction and noise and activity, it can be pretty hard to hear what truth has to tell us. So the second phase is really about pushing aside everything that's not true so that what is true can begin to shine through. And when this happens, this is when you get to the core of the beliefs you have about yourself that are holding you back. Now, the third phase in this process is to create a new message. Now, this is basically creating an affirmation. Some of you may love affirmations. Some of you may say, well, yeah, I've tried them, and frankly, I find them useless, ineffective, a waste of time. If you happen to fall into that second camp, I would be willing to wager that regardless of how powerful any particular affirmation was that you were using, it wasn't the right one for you. No, we all have very custom created self-doubts. If we're to overcome them, we need a custom designed solution that speaks directly to those lies we uncovered in that second phase, that speaks directly to them, that strips them of their power, that supports and encourages us. And that's what this third phase is about, creating an affirmation that suits you and your situation. Once you've got that new message, then you just need to practice it. This is what I was doing for those 40 minutes back in college. I was thinking the same things over and over and over. Those thoughts had become as ingrained and as automatic as the notes I was learning. Now, I learned lots of tips and techniques to make sure that practicing becomes effective and really long-lasting. And as important as that is, what's really important is to realize that practicing this new message is where the rubber meets the road. You can do those other three phases flawlessly, but if you fail to practice that new message, you don't put into action what you've learned, nothing changes. All your tomorrows, they're going to be pretty much like all your yesterdays. So how do we know that practicing a message will actually reprogram our minds? Well, this is what the inner critic does all the time. It's been telling you the same stories year after year. Now, its messages maybe have been more condemnation than affirmation, but the process is the same. What you think repeatedly becomes your belief. It becomes the way you show up in the world. Now, you came here tonight, I'm guessing, to network, to meet people, to make connections in ways that serve both you and the other person. But let me ask you, how often have you gone to a network event, seen someone that, I would like to approach them, and then had this voice in your head tell you things that make you feel awkward, make you feel intimidated or worried that, I'm afraid I'm going to come off too salesy, or worse yet, not salesy enough. What would be different if this voice instead encouraged you, if it helped you to show up more authentically, if it made you feel like $1 million? There's a way to make that happen, and it's not by throwing spaghetti at the wall. And it doesn't have to be hard, and you don't have to do it alone. This method that I've just described can reprogram your voice in your head so that it supports you. If you are interested in learning more about this, I'm happy to talk about you with this later. You can also contact me through my website, paulboehnke.com, PaulBoehnke.com. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.